Hello everyone and welcome back to AP Bio with AP Playground. Today we're covering topic 8.2, energy flow through ecosystems. Lots to talk about today, but we'll be starting with the strategies organisms use to acquire and use energy, then moving on to energy flow and biogeochemical cycling, and lastly, autotrophs and heterotrophs. And our suggested skill is argumentation 6D, explain the relationship between experimental results and larger biological concepts, processes, or theories. And so organisms need energy. This is to organize, to grow, to reproduce, and to also maintain homeostasis, which is a stable internal environment that is maintained despite external changes. An example of this is thermoregulation, maintaining internal temperature. Humans are endotherms, meaning they're warmed by the heat generated through metabolism. So as chemical reactions occur within the body, energy lost during these reactions is released as heat, and that warms endotherms. However, ectotherms get heat from external sources. They cannot warm themselves. So for instance, we have this sunbathing iguana. It is in the sun because it is getting energy and heat from the sun in order to warm itself up. And when you have a net gain in energy, that means that you can perform storage, growth, and survive and reproduce. And the reproductive strategy can even be different based on the energy available. And so organisms, some species, organisms that don't have as much energy will reproduce asexually instead of increasing genetic variation and diversity through sexual reproduction, because it takes energy to find a mate, and it takes energy in order to reproduce sexually more so than it does to do so asexually. We also see reproductive diapause, where organisms will just cease to reproduce until the environment is stable and they're able to gain enough energy to do so. And with the net loss in energy, that means there's going to be less reproduction and eventual death. And a metabolic rate is the total energy used, and smaller animals have a higher metabolic rate due to their surface area to volume ratio, which we discussed back in topic 2.2. And with this higher surface area to volume ratio, meaning they have a lot of surface area for their volume, and smaller objects and organisms have this, that means they're going to be losing heat a lot faster, and so they're going to need more energy in order to maintain homeostasis compared to larger animals, which have a smaller surface area to volume ratio. So now we're going to discuss energy flow and cycling of matter. So to do this, we first have to look at the different levels of organization there are within the environment. So we start from populations, which are just individuals of the same species that live in one region. Then communities, where we're going up to like different species and their interactions, and we'll discuss community ecology in 8.5. Then ecosystems, where we're focusing on both biotic and abiotic factors, so living and non-living factors. And lastly, biomes, which is the whole overall geographic region that contains these ecosystems. And so energy flows through ecosystems, both biotic and abiotic factors like we just discussed, between organisms. And all of this energy is going to be sourced from the sun. The sun is going to be our primary source of energy, which is then going to transfer through photosynthetic organisms and through then carnivorous and herbivorous organisms through cellular respiration. Whereas matter and nutrients are cycled. So energy is going to be transferred between different organisms, while matter and nutrients are going to be cycled throughout the ecosystem. And so there are both abiotic and biotic reservoirs for these biogeochemical cycles, which are both life-based and earth and chemical-based, and processes that cycle matter between these reservoirs. And reservoirs are any area where these matter and nutrients are going to be stored. And so we see the law of conservation of mass and the law of conservation of energy saying that these things cannot be created or destroyed. They can only be transferred from one form to another, with matter and nutrients being cycled and energy being transferred between solar to chemical to heat energy. So we're going to be looking at our biogeochemical cycles next. And there are 4 of these we're discussing. We're starting with the water cycle. And so this is going to be happening within the hydrosphere, which is all of water on Earth combined. It encompasses all water on Earth. And so our processes that we'll be looking at are going to be evaporation, transpiration, condensation, and precipitation. And our reservoirs include oceans, surface water, atmosphere, and organisms. So water is going to evaporate from oceans and surface water, meaning that the sun's heat will cause the bonds in water to break, and so it will turn turn into a gas and rise up because it is now lighter, and it will transpire from plants, which is similar to evaporation, but it occurs from plants. In the atmosphere, it will condense, meaning it will get cooler and turn back closer into a liquid, become a cloud, and eventually precipitation will occur where this water will be rained down back onto these reservoirs of water, including oceans and surface water. And organisms are also going to be intaking water in order to survive and perform metabolic function, and then they're going to be excreting it after these functions have been done. Moving on to the carbon cycle. Carbon is going to be transferred between the atmosphere and biosphere, so between the sort of air and all of the molecules within that and the biosphere, so life. And so it's going to be transferring within life between organisms and also within the atmosphere, changing from carbohydrates to carbon dioxide. And so they're going to be carbon dioxide will be turned into carbohydrates through photosynthesis, through the light-dependent and light-independent reactions, and then it'll be released into the atmosphere again through cellular respiration. And so this cycle will continue from photosynthesis and respiration, acting as the inputs and outputs for each other. We also see decomposition, where dead organic matter will be broken down, again releasing nutrients into the environment, as well as combustion, where a substance will react with an oxygen such as oxygen, producing heat and light, and this will also release carbon back into the atmosphere. So carbon is generally going to be traveling through life, as it is also the backbone of life, and then once organic matter is either dead or through metabolic processes, it will be returned to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Nitrogen cycle is quite complicated here. We're looking at both the biosphere and the atmosphere again, and the largest reservoir is the atmosphere. About 70% of the atmosphere is made up of nitrogen. And so we have a few steps here, and we're going to be looking at a few different forms as well. So first, certain bacteria in the soil are going to fix nitrogen gas. This is known as fixation, and it is actually a little difficult to see here, but there we go. There is going to be the addition of hydrogen to this nitrogen gas, and this will turn it into ammonia, and through the soil picking up more nutrients, it will become ammonium. And so this ammonia will also be converted to nitrates, and this process is known as nitrification. Plants are going to get nutrients, and bacteria will get compounds from these plants, and this is known as assimilation. So plants are going to get nutrients from the soil, bacteria are going to get compounds from the plants through assimilation, and so these nitrates and ammonia will be incorporated into these living organisms through assimilation, and when organisms die, ammonia will be released back into the soil, that's ammonification, and nitrates will be converted back into nitrogen gas through denitrification by bacteria. So essentially, if we look over here, we can see we have nitrogen in the atmosphere through fixation, and nitrogen fixing bacteria. It's going to be going to plants. We see then nitrifying bacteria turning nitrates, and with assimilation and absorption of nitrates again, there's going to be absorption into plants, which will then be eaten by animals, and so nitrogen will travel this way through the biosphere, and once plants and animals decompose, we're going to go back to ammonification. Ammonia is released into the soil, and nitrates are going to be converted back to gas through denitrification, eventually leading back to nitrogen gas within the atmosphere. Last up is the phosphorus cycle, and this one talks about the biosphere, the hydrosphere, and the lithosphere, which is going to be like the crust of the earth. And so weathering rocks are going to release phosphate into the soil and groundwater. And weathering rocks meaning rocks that are being affected by erosion, so wind, water, any other forces that could be breaking up the rock. And this is going to release phosphate into the soil and into water on the ground, which will then be taken up by plants and as a result transferred to animals that eat those plants. And then it will return to the soil through decomposition and excretion by those animals and plants. Alright, so now we have to talk about how within the biosphere all of this matter actually cycles. And we're looking at both autotrophs and heterotrophs here. Autotrophs are the producers in the environment. They capture energy from the environment and then form it into chemical energy that can be used. So we often look at photosynthetic energy and photosynthesis, which is energy captured from the sun by plants and by algae. But there's also chemosynthetic organisms, where in the absence of oxygen, in the absence of sunlight, they are forming and gaining energy from inorganic molecules. Then we have heterotrophs. These are the consumers, and they're going to capture energy in carbon compounds by consuming energy from organic matter in autotrophs. In other words, consumers are going to be eating autotrophs in order to gain energy from them. And from this energy, they'll be able to metabolize carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. And also store energy within these forms and gain energy from them. And then when we look at heterotrophs, we're looking at herbivores, omnivores, carnivores, decomposers, scavengers. Herbivores are eating plants. Omnivores eat both animals and plants. Carnivores are meat eaters. Decomposers are breaking down dead matter into nutrients, and scavengers are consuming this dead matter for nutrients. So we're going to return one more time to energy flow through ecosystems, looking at trophic levels. And energy flows through trophic levels, which shows levels in a food web. And a food web shows energy relationships between organisms in an ecosystem. So in other words, who eats what? And we can see a food web here where we start with these plants that are eaten by grasshoppers, bees, rabbits, and then the hawk is going to eat the rabbit. The mouse is going to eat the grasshopper. The hawk will also eat the mouse. And so through food webs, we can see the complex interactions between organisms in an environment. But within trophic levels, we see the energy transfer that actually occurs between these levels in the food web. And so we're looking at producers, primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers in that order. And we look at the 10% rule here, where only 10% of the energy between trophic levels, so for instance between producers and primary consumers, is transferred. 10% between primary consumers and secondary consumers is transferred, and so forth, because the rest is going to be lost as heat within the energy transfer. And a change in the number of producers and a change in sunlight can greatly affect the rest of trophic levels, because less producers mean there's less energy for the primary consumers, which means there's less energy for the secondary consumers, which means there's less energy for the tertiary consumers. Same thing, less sunlight means less producers are able to grow and provide that energy for the rest of the trophic levels within the food web. So there you have it. Energy flows through ecosystems. We discussed thermoregulation and the maintenance of homeostasis. We discussed energy flow through trophic levels and food webs, autotrophs versus heterotrophs, and lastly, cycling of nutrients through biogeochemical cycles. We'll see you in 8.3 to discuss population ecology.